Thank you very much. This talk is actually going to be about scientific misconduct. First, conflict of interest disclosure. I'm the editor-in-chief of CHEST. While CHEST is the official journal of the ACCP and the ACCP is the publisher, I have complete editorial independence from the publisher. Much of the content of this talk actually can be found in a publication in CHEST in 2009. It has been updated, however. God bless you. I think definitions are important, and we should start there. Of course, a very famous, really good publication is Wikipedia, but there was good information that was there. They define a conflict of interest as a situation in which someone is in a position of trust, and trust is a really important word for this presentation, in which someone has competing professional or personal interests. A conflict of interest exists if no unethical or improper act results from it. And another definition is a conflict of interest can create an appearance of impropriety that can undermine confidence. Disclosure of financial and non-financial associations in biomedical journals is commonly required, as you know. And the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors actually trying to make it easy for authors to actually not have to repeat their conflict of interest disclosures from multiple journals, thought that they would come up with a uniform format for disclosing. And that was first announced in all of their journals in 2009, and I just highlight the New England Journal of Medicine publication. But I must tell you that there are some things missing from it. It's still in beta testing. And the major thing for us that's missing is that it doesn't require the author to actually give what the monetary values for a variety of conflicts that they might have. And since we do think that that's still important, we have not gone ahead using the uniform format. But if you would look at the CHEST instructions for authors and the disclosure form, you'll see that we define a conflict of interest as a financial relationship or other set of circumstances that might affect or might reasonably be thought by others to affect an author's judgment, conduct, or manuscript. And specifics in that include anything else that could affect my objectivity or independence related to the manuscript or the perception by others of my objectivity and independence. And in this area, we specifically talk about ghost authorship. You don't know who the author is, although the author actually participated in the study, but they didn't want you to know that, perhaps because they have industry ties. A ghost writer, somebody who writes the paper, and you don't know who they are, usually somebody working for a medical education company. Or a guest author, somebody who actually is invited to be on the paper, had nothing to do with the work, but because he or she's got a big name, the feeling is that more people would read this particular paper. Those are really bad things to stay away from. And then we do not have an official disclosure form for reviewers, but they are encouraged and actually do, in a confidential way, tell us what their potential conflicts are. So my perspective on the definition of a conflict of interest, and it's really important to say this because depending upon where you are in the world, this doesn't apply to Israel, but may apply to Southeast Asia countries. The conflict of interest actually is a Western construct. If getting ahead causes you to have internal harmony, even if it means you step on other people or do something wrong, that's not actually looked at in certain societies as being bad. Declaring a potential conflict of interest is not admitting to or being considered by others as doing anything wrong. Rather, it informs readers that you're open and honest, therefore trustworthy. Because a real conflict of interest is the opposite, and again this relates to certain countries, opposite of harmony, it must be eliminated as much as possible. So when I go to certain countries and give this talk, I actually talk about harmony as an issue, not necessarily doing something that would qualify as scientific misconduct. And that harmony can be restored by not hiding the conflict of interest. Today, conflict of interest is one of the most important issues in medical publishing, as I'm sure you're aware. So I had highlighted the word trust, and we're all doctors or taking care of patients in one way or another. And our patients trust us. Our readers actually take care of patients, and therefore we should publish things that they would think would be trustworthy. They should be able to count on what we are publishing. So actually talking about medical trust in the context of scientific writing, I think relates to what I'm talking about. Mark Hall and Kevin Weinfurt have written a lot about medical trust, done a lot of empirical work in this area. And if I could quote them by saying, medical trust is the willingness to be vulnerable, as if you're a patient, with the expectation that the caretaker intends to protect the patient's interests. Medical trust, and they've done this work, is measurable and consists of three things: fidelity, implying strict and continuing faithfulness to an obligation, trust, or duty; competence; and honesty. So why do I actually feel the need to talk about this topic? The reasons are on this slide. Real or perceived conflict of interest situations pervade our society. Medicine and the reporting of scientific information. Physicians and researchers often don't even know when they have a conflict. For example, many believe that they're more immune to industry influence than other physicians. There's actually a very famous study that's constantly quoted by medical educators, where there were residents who actually were interviewed, and they were asked, so if you were given certain monetary value, a gift by industry, would that affect your relationship with that industry? And the person who would be asked would say, absolutely not. And then they would say, well, what about your roommate? Or what about your friend? And the answer was, yeah, they would be influenced. So many believe that they're immune, but the person next to them probably wasn't immune to that kind of problem. Another issue is the public trust in research has been eroded. There's a perception that professional fidelity and honesty on the part of investigators and clinicians has deteriorated, and many believe that physicians can be bought. And the last thing that I would say is why I feel the need to talk about this topic relates to my experience as the editor-in-chief of Chest. I am not thinking that I'm naive, but I have been stunned by the things that we have uncovered at Chest since I have been the editor, since 2005. People have been outright dishonest, but most of the time when they've done something wrong, they have no idea that they have done something that's unethical. It's as if it's not intuitively obvious to many of our authors that they're doing something that's not right. And perhaps, and I would think that that's a reflection of where we stand in society today. So here's a cartoon, as you probably know, or if you don't know, you should take a look at it. We have an editorial cartoon that we publish every month. I love NASCAR, can I have your autograph? Sorry kid, I'm a doctor. So, I mean, here you see a variety of different drugs. We tried not to put the drug names on, on the jacket, but I think this is a reflection of what the people on the street actually often think about physicians because of the ties to industry. Well, what I'm going to do now is, again, as I did with my talk this morning, pose and answer a series of questions. Why has the public trust in the clinical research industry been eroded? And it's obvious. All you have to look at is headlines in any of media, whether it be on television or whether it be the paper or whether it be online. Antidepressant makers withhold data. Drug maker charged with fraud over Paxil marketing. Drug makers prefer silence on test data. Don't publish negative trials. Firms violate U.S. law by not registering trials. Drug companies draw criticism. Some major drug manufacturers, including Dow, Components, a Merck and Company, and Pfizer, are being criticized in a published report for failure to disclose results from clinical studies on new medications. Pharmaceutical industry cannot be trusted to deal with biased reporting of clinical trials without stricter regulation, says the Royal Society of Medicine. And here, and I think this was such a shameful thing that this individual did, is the latest and probably most horrendous evidence of scientific misconduct that has come along. This actually was broken on 60 Minutes, this story, Deception at Duke, Fraud in Cancer Care, and it was aired on 60 Minutes just before we ended up coming here. Chemotherapy can be a tough road for people with cancer, often debilitating and even dangerous, which is why 5 years ago when Duke University announced that it had an advanced experimental treatment that would match the chemotherapy to a patient's own genetic makeup, it was hailed as the holy grail of cancer care. So Dr. Pody lied. He made up data that could not be confirmed by investigators at MD Anderson, continued to lie about it, and finally Duke did an investigation, was able to determine that the gentleman actually fudged all of his data. The public is aware that scientific misconduct is not a new phenomenon, not limited to the pharmaceutical industry, and not limited to the clinical scientific industry. The public does perceive that scientific misconduct is and has been pervasive, and the Pody story is yet the latest and most egregious, I think, of all. Two major scandals regarding suppression of results that came to light in 2004 were revealed as the tip of an iceberg of scientific misconduct, and that actually caused there to be a serious attempt to have registration of trials in all of the major journals, and it happened. The disclosure of fake skin transplant in white mice at the Sloan Kettering Institute in New York in '74 introduced the modern era of scientific fraud in medicine perpetrated by investigators. The revelation of the 2012 deception at Duke is a new example. Industry-funded trials, whether they involve trials of medicines, medical devices, or surgical interventions, are more likely to be associated with statistically significant pro-industry findings. Failure on the part of some editors and journals to disentangle themselves from commercial biases due to financial pressure from advertising, or editors' conflicts of interest represent a fundamental threat to the credibility of journals and to science. So editors of journals actually have not been free from the criticism that I'm talking about. A really unbelievable example is that the editor-in-chief of Neuropsychopharmacology published a favorable article on a controversial new treatment for depression, vagus nerve stimulation, resistant to conventional treatments is another example. All 9 authors, and he was one of them in his own journal, had major conflicts of interest. He had stock in the company, and he hired a ghostwriter in his own journal to actually write the paper. Journals have not consistently or aggressively required authors to disclose potential conflicts of interest. Another example. An article in JAMA warned pregnant women that their risk of falling back into depression would increase if they stopped taking antidepressant medicines. Most of the 13 authors were paid consultants or lecturers by makers of the drugs, and financial ties were not disclosed because authors didn't think the ties were relevant and the journal didn't aggressively check. So Catherine DeAngelis, who was the editor-in-chief of JAMA at that time, felt very badly that they hadn't actually checked and yet published the article. And then the public, certainly in the United States, has concerns about the FDA. The FDA, without appropriate regulatory reform, and this was a few years ago, cannot be counted on to protect patients. And our editorial cartoonist captured, I think, what the feeling on the street in the U.S. was. So it's appropriate that we started our day talking about sleep disorders. He's fallen asleep on the job. Where does he work? The FDA. So how often is the ethical concept of equipoise violated in industry-sponsored randomized controlled clinical trials? I think we should start with, I'm sure you all know it, but just in case there's somebody here who doesn't know the definition of equipoise, it is the uncertainty principle. But the definition is the concept of equipoise, or the uncertainty principle, is a central ethical principle of clinical research. Is supposed to ensure that a subject can be enrolled in a phase 3 randomized controlled trial only, and I emphasize only, if there's true uncertainty about which trial arm is most likely to benefit the patient. If trials are designed with a high likelihood of being positive, they are flawed by design bias. Design bias is not consistent with the equipoise principle. Design bias potentially benefits the sponsor by increasing scientific efficiency, good for the companies, decreases drug development costs, decreases the number of subjects required in the study, and probably decreases the aggregate risks to participants. However, design bias is in conflict with the Belmont, Nuremberg, and other sets of ethical principles. So what are the data that relate to the violation of equipoise? You'd think that, well, maybe there would be a few studies. Not true. Focused scholarly surveys of approximately 1,000 randomized controlled trials published in a 15-year period of time, ending in 2005, showed that systematic bias favors products made by the company funding the researcher. Studies funded by drug companies were more likely to have outcomes favoring the sponsor than were other studies, and explanations included use of an inappropriate comparator and publication bias. For example, safe doses of psychiatric drugs were compared to unsafe higher doses of a competitor's drug. Therapeutic doses of NSAIDs in the rheumatologic literature were actually compared to subtherapeutic doses of a competitor's drug. So the editors didn't pick it up, the researchers didn't pick it up, and the company used the data of an unfair comparison that made their drugs look good. Similar pro-industry trends were reported between 1990 and 2000, and 2005, and included surgical as well as medical trials. Interesting study for abstracts submitted to a rheumatologic meeting. In a study that sought to determine the frequency with which equipoise conditions were met in industry-sponsored randomized controlled trials, the authors studied abstracts accepted for the 2001 meeting. All studies were positive, favoring the drug. So you didn't have to go to any of the sessions. You didn't have to read anything. The results were basically fixed. So how often does under-declared over-reporting, I'll tell you what that means, occur in industry-sponsored randomized controlled clinical trials? Under-declared over-reporting is when sponsors prevent studies unfavorable to their products from being published or selectively reporting favorable studies. This is called publication bias. And other examples include publishing funded research in supplements as proceedings of symposia, where it is notorious that peer review is less intense or not at all. Promoting interpretive spin of data that exaggerates benefits or minimizes the risks of the company's products. Duplicating publication of positive results. Because subjects enroll in studies to benefit medical science and society, and negative studies further medical knowledge, it's unethical to fail to submit negative studies for publication. And contrary to current opinion, negative studies are often published in high-impact journals when they're submitted and undergone good review. So are there data that relate to publication bias? And as you would imagine, there are lots of these, but just as many as design bias problems. Again, looking at those same sort of studies that we looked at before, focused scholarly reviews of greater than 1,000 Randomized controlled trials published over that same 15-year period of time showed that systematic bias favors products made by the company funding the research. Studies funded by drug companies more likely to have outcomes favoring the sponsor. Among cardiovascular trials funded solely by for-profit organizations published in high-impact journals, 67% favored newer treatments, and the explanations included publication as well as design bias. And among cardiovascular trials funded solely by not-for-profit organizations such as the NIH, published in the same journals, just as many, it's like a flip of the coin as to whether they would favor or not favor innovation. And again, this is another example of negative trials often get published when they're submitted. An analysis, and this is a well-known story, you may not have heard it, it's pretty entertaining, of internal industry documents regarding the promotion of gabapentin, the trade name in the United States is Neurontin, showed the following. Publications in medical literature were used to advance marketing goals for the drug. Park-Davis employed a publication strategy to use research not to gain FDA approval for new indications, but to disseminate the information as widely as possible through the world's medical literature. Documents expressed the concern that negative results could harm promotional efforts and indicated the intention to publish and publicize results only if they were favorable. The company contracted with medical education companies to develop review papers, original articles, and letters to the editor about gabapentin for somewhere between $13,000 and $18,000 an article, even for favorable letters to the editor, including honoraria for the physician or pharmacist authors. Most were favorable, some were neutral, none were negative. There's a drug that needed to find a disease, and so a variety of urologists went out and came up with the term of irritable bladder. So a whole bunch of basic, not basic, clinical researchers went off with the drug company and came up with that new diagnosis so that their particular product actually could make a lot of money for them. And it worked. So here we see the summary of data that relate to publication bias frequency. Sponsors prevent studies on fatal-to products from being published. I don't have good data, but when I do, I put in parentheses. But it clearly happens too often. Industry-sponsored academic researchers clearly are denied access to research results. Greater than 50% of pharmaceutical companies report requiring investigators to keep information confidential for greater than 6 months after study completion, delaying dissemination of crucial information. Publishing funded research and supplements as proceedings of symposia with no or less intense peer review clearly happens. Promoting interpretive spin of data that exaggerates benefits or minimizes risks of the company's products occurs. And we have data on frequency of guest authors, ghost authors, and ghost writers. Duplicating publication of positive results, especially in supplements, for those journals that continue to do that, and we have basically stopped for industry-sponsored supplements, still is occurring. I'm not sure that everybody really knows the definition of duplicate publication, so this is my attempt to make sure that everybody does know. A duplication is defined as the simultaneous or subsequent publication of the major components or more of an article 2 or more times in one or more forms, whether it be print or electronic. So this could, as you'll see below, not just, it could include just a design, the material and methods section, tables, one graph where you've published it before but now publishing it again as if it's new data, the discussion, or even a letter to the editor. And it occurs sometimes up to 28% of the time. And up to 32% of the time, there's no reference to the original report when it came out. Most duplicate articles appear within 1 year of the original publication. So I mention that because, I mean, there are people who have actually studied this information. Do all of these examples qualify as conflict of interest in the reporting of scientific information? I think that it does if we insert the word trust. And I've already said it before, if we're taking care of patients or we're publishing information that relates to taking care of patients, and the patients are making themselves vulnerable because they trust the individuals who are taking care of them, and the individuals taking care of them are getting their information, let's say, from CHEST, then I do think that there clearly is a conflict of interest. And all that I have shared with you, conflict of interest in the reporting of scientific information. So we don't have the interactive keypad, but why don't you just think to yourself what the answer to this question is. Which of the following activities is considered ethical? Being a ghostwriter, being a ghost author, being a guest author, acknowledging that there was a paid writer, or none of the above? And the answer is D. As long as you acknowledge what you've done, doesn't mean that you're a bad person, but you are being transparent and telling people what you've done. But it is important that you say who actually this writer works for and how much money that individual was paid, and exactly what the activities of that writer were. Scientific conflict of interest discovered at CHEST since 2005. We have seen duplicate publication, including self-plagiarism. It turns out that the ethicists would tell you that even if you don't, you've written it, if you just write it again, and you didn't say that you wrote it again, that's actually unethical because you're not being honest with somebody that, you actually are written a major part of, before what you were writing again. Undisclosed salami publication. So this is, you have a big database, and instead of putting all the important information in one paper, you manage to slice it up like you would a salami and get multiple publications. So that you never really gave anybody the full message and results and conclusions of your study in one place, which would make it easy for somebody, to find. Plagiarism. We're dealing with another example of this now. Undisclosed pharmaceutical company funding. Falsifying research data before and after publication, such as falsifying research data and images, using another's ideas without permission or credit, inadequate record keeping that might permit misconduct to occur, or difficult to investigate. Ghost authors and ghost writers and guest authors we had to uncover it ourselves. Simultaneous submission to 2 or more journals. You fill out a copyright form saying, no part of this paper is being submitted anyplace else. Nobody's looking at this paper right now. First week that I'm the editor-in-chief, I send this paper off to somebody who calls me on the phone and says, I'd be happy to review this paper. It's just that I'm reviewing it for another journal at the present time. So we call the author up and say, could you help us understand how this happened? He said, oh, that's not right. I actually submitted it to 3 journals. We dealt with that. Authors of an abstract indicted for fraud and murder. Unauthorized use of a copyrighted quality of life instrument. I don't think people appreciate this, but it's becoming more and more clear that this is becoming a bigger issue. So there are health-related quality of life instruments out there. Somebody has done all the psychometric testing. You know the reliability and validity. You know the minimal important difference. You know the responsiveness of this particular instrument. Somebody takes it and modifies it and does a study with that. So one of the reasons to copyright something like that is so that you have to get permission. So we actually, because nobody reads the instructions to authors, maybe except for you people, so it's a required field now when you submit your manuscript. It is, so the health-related quality of life instrument, or the instrument that you use, did you get copyright approval? And did you modify the form? and you need to obviously give the correct answers. And then we actually now require, because we've had problems in the past, that people send us, they scan the permission that they actually could use this, and they upload it with their paper. And again, I've mentioned altering a copyrighted instrument. There's an issue where, the original psychometric testing and development of an instrument could have been done in English, and then somebody in another country takes the instrument and translates that into their own language. There's a very rigorous way of forward and backward translating of an instrument, and the developer actually has to participate in saying that, I think that this all makes sense. So, taking somebody's instrument and translating it into another language, you need to do it the right way. So here's another interactive slide for you. As the 15th author on a duplicate publication, you are potentially at risk of all of the following sanctions, except A, being banned from publishing in the journal for a record for 5 years, having a division chief chair or dean notified, having your name associated with a duplicate publication tag in PubMed for eternity, or none, because you only helped by proofreading the paper. So, you're potentially at risk of all of those except for, is there something that's okay to do on this? The answer is no. Well, except D is the answer. Just because you're the 15th author doesn't mean that you get off free. You actually shouldn't be an author unless you actually participated in all aspects of the journal. You helped collect the data, you thought about it, you conceived of it, you helped write it. So just proofreading it shouldn't make you an author. What's being done to restore the public trust? So active strategies include removal as much as possible, not allowing potentially conflicted authors to chair guidelines or guidelines sections. The ACCP has a very rigorous process for all of its guideline panel members. Requiring more robust disclosure, have authors state if they have access to all the data, have companies perform independent statistical reviews. If it's large randomized controlled clinical trials with multiple sites, you could be responsible not for all of the data, but for certain parts of it and certain parts of the analysis. Transparency, however, telling us what you've done is not enough, as I'll describe in a minute. Recusal, so you abstain from. Reviewers actually recuse themselves when they feel that they have a conflict, and again, we could do a better job in that regard about making sure that we don't have conflicted reviewers. Third-party evaluations, vetting members of a writing committee before the work of the committee begins, and again, the ACCP, I think, has been a leader in this regard with respect to their guideline committee members. Requiring more intense adherence to codes of ethics, so everybody's jumped on board. Increasing awareness of this particular problem. So we actually have now instituted, as of January, a plagiarism software detection software program and image falsification, and since January, we're now finding more bad things with respect to these two issues. So you should be aware that there are software companies that are actually helping us develop these things because there is such a huge problem out there. Other authors and collaborators are turning into whistleblowers. Reviewers are picking things up. Readers are picking things up. Educators and mentors actually need to be training anybody who's doing research in your particular institution, and there are watchdog groups. And so let me just speak to those last two things. So increasing awareness of the educators and mentors. There's something called Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative. It's now worldwide. Our institution participates, and that is that anybody who's going to be doing any patient-related research has to take this program and has to take the test and pass the test. Our institution has now actually implemented a plagiarism software. So we cannot submit a paper anywhere from our institution unless we can prove to the medical school that none of the paper has actually been plagiarized. And fellowship training program. So we uncovered some bad thing that happened, and there were some fellows and postdocs on the paper, And we actually had the institution deal with it. And one of the things that journal editors can do is that you can insist to avoid punishing the young people who were trusting the junior faculty who did something bad. We let them off the hook by basically saying, you institute this particular program, you send me the outline, and you're going to promise me that you're going to do it every single year from now on. And so we actually forced that institution to do that. Watchdog Groups, let me just mention the one on the bottom, Retraction Watch. Every time a journal prints a retraction, this person who does this blog, just congratulates us and just, spreads this information widely. But there are active strategies to mitigate conflict of interest in scientific reporting. There's regulatory reform in the United States, started in 1997 by the FDA, required registration of trials testing drugs for life-threatening diseases and conditions. It actually led to the clinicaltrials.gov website that's administered by the National Library of Medicine. And then they amended the act, requires registering the results of the trials for industry within 3 years of completion of the primary aim of the study. There's clinical trials registration. If you actually don't register your trial before you randomized your first patient, it's not likely that you're going to get your paper into a first-class journal. And hopefully one day, not in any journal. There's mandated disclosure of payments to physicians in the United States by pharmaceutical companies, and under the new Healthcare Reform Act, Obamacare, the United States is going to force drug firms to report money paid to the doctors with dollars amounts, and it's probably going to happen in January of 2013. The status of trial registration. This all started in 2004. Members of the Committee of Medical Journal Editors published a policy statement that they're going to consider a Phase 3 trial for publication only if it has been registered before enrollment to the first patient. And I'm sure that you're all aware of the 20 elements, and they actually followed what the World Health Organization said that we should do. Things got even tougher in 2008. These editors required the registration of all clinical trials, including Phase 1 and pharmaceutical trials. Once trials registered, both the FDA and these journals, editors require the registration be updated at least every 12 months for the FDA and every 6 months by the ICMJE. Just follows the lead of both of those. There are a whole host of trial registries that have to be transparent, and there can't be money made on instituting any of these. People were concerned that once we had trial registration, this would destroy innovation. Has not happened. The potential benefits are to eliminate violation of the ethical concept of equipoise or the uncertainty principle. Really helps editors and others understand the context of study results. Eliminate underdeclared over-reporting, ensure the integrity of evidence-based medicine, improve the efficiency of clinical research. So if you have a great idea, you should go see if somebody registered the same idea. And if they are actually a group that always follows through and gets things done, you should think of another idea. So it actually helps you decide what you would be doing next. It actually ensures that the results are not lost to the body of general medical knowledge by making sure that you knew that there was a trial, and hopefully they would publish the negative trial, but at least you knew there was a trial. And it actually does promote innovation for the reason that I said you could think about doing something else if a really good group has already thought of your idea first. So let me conclude with the following. As stated by Marcia Engel when she was briefly the New England Journal of Medicine editor-in-chief, she said it would be naive to conclude that bias is only a matter of a few isolated instances. It permeates the entire system. Physicians can no longer rely on the medical literature for valid and reliable information. Clinicians just do not know anymore how safe and effective prescription drugs really are, but the products are probably nowhere near as good as the published literature indicates. It's more than a matter of perception or appearances. It's a matter of public health. But let me assure you, strategies are in place and things have already improved, and I am optimistic. But just transparent disclosure of conflict of interest is not enough, because If somebody does something bad and says something that implies, or you might have gotten out of it, that maybe they can't be trusted, the fact that they disclosed it makes it your problem, not their problem. Thank you for your attention.